Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan and I'm a senior analyst at London Politica. I'm joined by Sharif and Antonio, and today we'll take a look at Europe's macroeconomic situation. Europe is once again in crisis. Inflation reached a record 8.9% in July, with predictions of a deep recession amid a winter that could see whole industries shut down and heating rationed for households. So all this merits the question, how did we get here?
Well, the backdrop to the current inflation is the COVID-19 pandemic and government responses. For months in 2020 and 2021, consumers were stuck at home and were limited in what goods they could buy using their income and any government stimulus they received. As economies reopened, all these pent-up demand for goods and services like holidays was released suddenly in a manner that was unnatural in an economy, while suppliers had not yet scaled their capacity to pre-pandemic levels. The COVID-19 pandemic also caused severe disruptions to global supply chains, most recently in March when factories in China had to be temporarily shut down or production limited because workers were forced to isolate as part of China's zero COVID policy. Finally, some analysts have pointed out that massive stimulus and bond buying packages introduced in the US and the EU, which included unprecedented rates of central bank financed public spending, injected huge amounts of money into their economies that was not matched by any increase in output. The EU constantly ramped up its pandemic emergency purchase program from 750 billion in March of 2020 to 1.35 trillion in June and 1.85 trillion in December. That's euros. At the time, this was necessary to avoid economic collapse as economies shut down and money flow slowed. However, this stimulus has now come back with a vengeance, as we are now faced with greater quantity of money essentially chasing an unchanged amount of goods and services, causing prices to rise across the board. The more recent and chief culprit of the inflation crisis is energy. For decades, Europe has relied on Russia's natural wealth for abundant, cheap energy, which over the years became a key competitive advantage of the European chemicals and manufacturing industries. Before the war, the EU relied on Russia on 40% of its gas, a quarter of oil imports, and about half of coal. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the West imposed its first round of sanctions, most targeting individuals involved in the takeover, banning arms imports from Russia, as well as borrowing technical assistance to major energy companies. However, the second round following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was much more comprehensive, with the EU intending to cut around 90% of its Russian oil imports. But the EU could not afford to ban Russian gas, which was too instrumental to its big economies like Germany and difficult to replace. Knowing this weakness, Russia retaliated to the sanctions by announcing in July it would close Nord Stream 1 pipeline, the main pathway of gas to Europe, for a 10-day maintenance period. It has since reopened, but is now only operating at 20% capacity. Russia also plans to shut it down for 3 more days, starting 31st of August, and many analysts believe it's only a matter of time before the gas is cut off permanently. As a result, German gas prices have risen tenfold since last year and electricity sevenfold. Energy has therefore been the biggest driver of euro area inflation, accounting for nearly half of the rise. Russia and Ukraine are also agricultural exporters of major global importance, supplying together over a quarter of globally traded wheat. And on top of that, Russia is the biggest global exporter of fertilizer at 15% of total world fertilizer exports. Acute food and energy shortages in developing countries in North Africa and Middle East could trigger new waves of economic refugees seeking safety in Europe, reinvigorating the EU's 2015 refugee crisis with serious political and social consequences. But these are problems with global effects. Jonathan, maybe you can speak on what makes Europe special in this case.
Other countries like China and India have not sanctioned Russia and continue to buy oil from it, often at favorable prices because European countries do not want it anymore and Russia is looking for buyers. The US and EU have led the international sanctions against Russia. However, unlike the US, which produces natural gas and also oil through fracking, the EU is a net energy importer and requires more than double the energy it can produce by itself. This reliance on other countries means that if supplies stop, Europe won't be able to make up the shortfall using domestic production and will suffer from shortages, which leads energy prices like electricity, heating, and petrol to spike. US inflation is primarily domestically generated, as seen by a substantial rise in core inflation, which does not include energy or food prices. Some causes are rapidly rising rents and higher wages leading people to bid up goods with a fixed supply. Traditionally, this is where the central bank, in this case the Federal Reserve, would raise interest rates, which is intended at slowing the volume and speed at which money flows around the economy, ultimately slowing inflation. And that's exactly what happened. The inflation we're seeing in Europe, in contrast, is mostly caused by external supply shocks. Raising interest rates may slow economic activity and therefore reduce demand for energy, but it will not resolve the fact that Europe's energy sources are simply not enough to fulfill even its stickiest demand. And that means high prices are here to stay. In fact, Europe has long relied on extremely low, even negative interest rates to stimulate its economy against some fundamental problems like an aging population. So raising interest rates and thereby cutting the supply of cheap money is like removing an important lifeline. It could backfire and drag the whole bloc into recession by slowing sectors that were not overheated in the first place. Finally, we need to look at which EU countries are most at risk to understand the severity of the problem. Unlike previous crises that centered on Europe's periphery, Greece, Ireland, Spain, it is Germany, the economic powerhouse of the EU, which now finds itself at the center of the energy crisis and at Russia's mercy. After years of shutting down dirty coal power plants and phasing out nuclear power plants in the wake of the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan, Germany has become highly reliant on natural gas for its power. That was all well and good until the Russia-Ukraine war broke out earlier this year. Now, Germany is asking for solidarity from reluctant EU neighbors that are less reliant on Russian gas, like France and Spain, who know they cannot afford to let Germany fail without substantial damage to their own economies. So, Antonio, maybe you can tell us more about what's ahead?
Yeah, sure. So the consequences on the EU depend on how much Russia cuts flows by. It could vary anywhere from high prices to industrial shutdowns, and at worst, heating for homes only being available in certain times of the day. European countries have been trying to stock up gas reserves by buying up any liquefied natural gas that remains in international markets. But so far, only Poland has filled up its reserves, and that's because it invested in gas pipelines from Norway long before the crisis, anticipating Russia's misbehavior. For example, Italian energy giant Eni signed a gas deal with Algeria's Sonatrach, but the problem is that the LNG will not arrive in time for winter, and in any case, it will supply about 9 billion cubic meters of gas, small peanuts compared to the EU's 150-170 billion cubic meters shortfall. Another measure that we will see more and more in the future is what the EU is doing right now, which is encouraging its citizens to reduce energy consumption this summer to conserve every bit possible from the upcoming winter. But again, this will save less than 10% of the shortage and will not make up for when gas consumption drastically increases this winter. Finally, EU countries are diversifying their energy sources, and they will keep trying to achieve it in the next years. As a long-term solution, green energy like wind and solar is the key to sustainable energy independence, and resources are being devoted to it as we saw in the REPower EU plan of the European Commission. But it won't be sufficient for this winter in the short term. So countries are stepping back to polluting fossil fuels, but they have run into unexpected problems. For example, Germany's main river, the Rhine, dried up so much this summer that some points became too shallow for coal barges to cross, denying much needed fuel from power stations. Also, Germany recently ruled against extending the lifetime of its last nuclear plants. In France, meanwhile, rivers that used to cool nuclear power plants became so warm that production had to be temporarily curtailed and France became a net energy importer. So, in sum, the EU now is stuck between a rock and a hard place, at least in the short term. Being tough on Putin comes at a price. EU citizens have so far expressed commendable solidarity with Ukraine, but their resolve could be tested this winter, when that comes at the expense of basic comforts. So in the best case, the Russia-Ukraine war would come to some negotiated settlement by then. But in the worst, Europeans are left to hope that Putin does not turn off the gas valve too far.
To learn more, you can access our full report on the EU energy crisis on London Politica's website. Thank you.